I want to turn my attention now to the regulatory systems that control physiological functions and maintain homeostasis. This happens at many levels: the biochemical pathways, enzyme activities. These are the smallest scales. But what about at the organismal level of animals, to coordinate organ systems, for instance? This involves centralized control through the neurons and endocrine system. I'll start by talking about endocrine control. Endocrine hormones are chemical substances secreted by endocrine cells and endocrine glands that are carried in extracellular fluids in the blood to target other cells, usually far distant from where the cells are located. The release of these hormones is triggered by neuronal stimulation or by other hormones. The specificity of hormones is determined by receptors on the target cells. Often these are membrane receptors, which trigger second messengers inside the cytoplasm, or they may travel to the nucleus to have their effect. Thus, the concentrations of hormones or the number and distribution of receptors can both affect the response. Neurohormones are chemicals that are released by neurons directly into the blood or extracellular space to also affect distantly located cells. Again, these cells have to have receptors in order to be responsive. This is not the same as neuronal synapses, where one neuron talks to another. This is where the hormone is actually released into the circulation. There are also cases where the hormonal effect is very local, not involving the circulatory system. Paracrine hormones are released by cells and affect other cells in their local area. Autocrine hormones are released by a cell and actually feed back to affect the same cell. There are three major classes of hormones in animals. Steroids are derived from cholesterol, which originates either from the food or can be endogenously made by the animal. The adrenal glands are a pair of glands that sit atop the kidneys. They have an outer cortex layer and an inner medulla layer. The adrenal cortex is responsible for making two major types of steroid hormones. Mineralocorticoids are involved in the regulation of mineral balance. So, for example, aldosterone is a major regulator of sodium. Glucocorticoids are also made in the adrenal cortex. These are involved in metabolic regulation, and one you may be familiar with is cortisol. The gonads are another major producer of steroids. They produce the sex steroids such as testosterone and estradiol. Steroids are lipid-soluble, they cross membranes, and they target cytoplasmic or nuclear receptors, usually. Peptide hormones are chains of 3 to up to 200 amino acids. GnRH and insulin are shown here. Peptide hormones are water-soluble, and they act on membrane receptors. Amine hormones are derived from amino acids. The most important classes are derived either from tyrosine or tryptophan. The two major classes derived from tyrosine are catecholamines and iodotyronines, or the thyroid hormones. Dopamine is very important in the brain, where it is active in the reward system. It's also important in Parkinson's disease, where a deficiency in the midbrain leads to tremors. Systemically, dopamine acts as a paracrine regulator and is active in the kidneys, the pancreas, and the digestive system. It also inhibits norepinephrine, which leads to vasodilation. Norepinephrine and epinephrine, also known as noradrenaline and adrenaline, are released from the adrenal medulla. These are often called medullary hormones. These hormones are metabolic regulators and they're involved in the fight or flight system. These three are water soluble. On the other hand, thyroid hormones are lipid soluble. They contain iodine and they act on nuclear or membrane receptors. As I indicated in the last lecture, iodine deficiency leads to metabolic problems, and this is because the thyroid hormones require iodine for their production. Melatonin is derived from tryptophan, and it's very important in the pineal gland, where it's involved in daily rhythms. This table summarizes the key characteristics of peptide, steroid, and amine hormones. You should study it carefully and learn the contents. There are a number of common themes that you need to notice. The first of all is water solubility. Peptides, catecholamines, and melatonin are water soluble, and this also means that they are stored inside vesicles, inside cells. Notice also that these water-soluble hormones are released from cells by exocytosis, whereas the lipid-soluble steroids and thyroid hormones are released by diffusion. The way in which hormones are transported in blood also differs between water and lipid-soluble ones. Notice that the lipid-soluble ones require soluble protein carriers to take them around in the blood. The water-soluble hormones simply dissolve in the blood and are carried that way. The half-life of hormones, or how long they stick around before they get broken down, also differs. The half-life is long in steroids and thyroid hormones, so again the lipid-soluble ones, and short in the water-soluble ones. The receptors for hormones also differ depending on whether they're water or lipid-soluble. The water-soluble hormones interact with surface proteins, triggering second messenger cascades, whereas the lipid-soluble ones, thyroid hormones and steroids, diffuse through the cell membrane and interact with nuclear receptors or cytoplasmic receptors. In terms of the physiological action of the hormones, notice that the lipid-soluble ones can alter gene expression, whereas the water-soluble hormones act through second messenger systems. Water-soluble hormones tend to act on existing proteins, whereas the lipid-soluble ones can lead to the synthesis of new proteins to have lasting effects. Now let's focus on a few key points about vertebrate animals. The first is the hypothalamo-pituitary axis. These structures act as master controllers of the other glands and systems throughout the body. This is a diagram of a basic vertebrate brain. You can see the hypothalamus at the base of the brain. This is actually part of the brain, and it's a very ancient structure. Below it you can see a structure called the neurohypophysis. This is also called the pituitary gland. They are physically connected, so this acts as a connection between the nervous system and the endocrine system. This is a diagram of the base of the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. The pituitary has two sections, the anterior and the posterior. The posterior pituitary is derived embryonically from the brain and is neurosecretory. Neurons project directly from the hypothalamus, which is a sensing center, to the posterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary has a rich blood supply, and these neurons secrete two neurohormones, which directly enter the circulation. The first of these is the antidiuretic hormone, so depending on the type of animal, this would be vasopressin or vasotocin. When the hypothalamus receives signals of high osmotic pressure or low blood volume, these neurons secrete the antidiuretic hormone, leading to the retention of water. Oxytocin is the other posterior pituitary neurohormone. It's very important in mammals in the expression of milk and lactation, and also during labor it's responsible for the uterine contractions that lead to birth. Oxytocin is used in human mothers to induce labor. The anterior pituitary gland is not of neural origin. It originates embryonically from the upper oral cavity. The anterior pituitary functions quite differently from the posterior pituitary. Neurons in the hypothalamus release a variety of releasing hormones or inhibiting hormones that flow through a specialized blood supply down to the anterior pituitary, acting on cells in the anterior pituitary to release the hormones that they make. This specialized blood supply is called the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system. The anterior pituitary releases two types of peptide hormones. The first type are called direct acting, meaning that they go out and act on other cells directly. The second type of hormone is called a tropic hormone. Tropic hormones control the release of hormones by other glands. This is why they're called tropins. In an earlier slide, I showed you GnRH, which is gonadotropin releasing hormone. This is a releasing hormone released from the neurons in the hypothalamus, which flows down to the anterior pituitary, causing it to release its gonadotropins, which I'll talk about in a minute.